Thank you, Ambassador Surendra Kumar. Thanks to IAFA. Thank you to all for coming this evening. I'm going to try and answer that set of questions by just making a few points about the international order. We talk about this, we like to talk about it, it sounds very vague, but I think it's important to distill a little bit what we mean when we talk about the international order. And what I'll do is very briefly, in just a few minutes, I'll try and cover a few points. One, what is the international order? How has it been beneficial? Who have been the biggest beneficiaries? What are some of the obstacles to the order? What are some of the challenges it faces? And then finally address the question that is being asked on here, which is the system collapsing? So briefly, what is the international order? Now, for much of human history, we have seen competing orders that have been designed in various regions. We had a Sino-centric order, we had the Europe, Western Christendom, an order based around Western Christendom. We had orders in India as well. And in many ways, the modern history has really been defined by the interaction and the competition between these orders. The Cold War, of course, was defined by two competing orders, a US-led international order and a Soviet-led international order. And countries such as India had to make decisions in that context. The post-Cold War international order, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, obviously was defined and created in an era of US primacy. And it meant a few things, again, in practice. One, it led to a widening of the discussion on how to govern the global commons. So issues like climate change, to some degree trade, governing cyberspace, were all issues in which India had to have a seat at the table. By virtue of its size, India could effectively stall consensus. You also saw a broadening of the economic architecture in the post-Cold War period. China was brought into the WTO. The G8 after the global financial crisis became the G20, or at least the G20 gained prominence. And when there wasn't reform, as with the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, you saw alternative entities coming up, the BRICS and the BRICS New Development Bank, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Where there was actual stagnation, at least in the institutions of this order, was in the security sphere. And if you think about the defining institutions of the security order in the world today, they're still largely legacies of the post-World War II and Cold War era. The UN Security Council, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NATO being some of them. Now, this order, for all of its flaws and benefit and advantages, has in many ways worked. And I think if one is to summarize it briefly, one could say that the world is now more peaceful, prosperous, and open than almost any time in history. The number of deaths in conflict have dropped from about 200,000 a year during the Cold War to less than 50,000 a year. There's now been a slight change in that after the Syrian civil war. In terms of development, I think this is quite self-evident, but everything from life expectancy to incomes to education indicators have improved around the world, again at different rates, at different speeds. And the world has also become more democratic. And a lot of the post-Cold War democratization of the world happened not because of the US efforts, but often despite US efforts. We've seen in some ways countries like Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, South Korea, and others democratize in this period. So there have been these benefits around the world, again at different rates and different paces. Who have been the biggest beneficiaries of this international order? If one defines it as contributions to global growth, the benefits, the material benefits at least, the biggest beneficiary by far has been China. China has become the world's leader in manufacturing, in exports, in energy production, in infrastructure. I don't need to go into more detail as to the many ways in which China has benefited. The second major beneficiary has been the United States. The US economy has grown by 10 trillion since 2000, so almost the size of China's total economy has been added to the US economy since 2000. 22 of the top 30 universities in the world, according to a Chinese ranking, are in the United States. China has only 2 in the top 100. The US has 800 overseas military facilities today. China has 1. If you look at every R&D in every cutting-edge technology, from artificial intelligence to robotics to defense, the US is still the global leader and the pace setter. And if you look at just the macro indicators of the US economy, the unemployment rate, almost 4% growth, the stock market's doing really well. The US clearly has been a beneficiary of the system. The third big beneficiary has been India. India has contributed 7% of global growth since 2008, since the financial crisis. It will, either by the end of this year or early next year, be the fifth largest economy, surpassing the UK. And if you look at any number of other indicators, India is already in a top 3. It's the second largest number of internet users, it's the third largest energy producer, and so forth. Now, what are some of the challenges to this existing order, to this international order? I think from India's point of view, we have to look at two very different types of challenges. One is the challenge of vested interests. That is, established powers who are reluctant to make changes to the international order to accommodate India's rise. And this varies on a case-by-case basis depending on the institution. So, for example, UN Security Council reform has stalled largely because of reluctance by the P5 to reform. The Bretton Woods institutions did not reform, largely as a result of resistance by Europe and the United States. Other institutions have not reformed because of resistance by China or Russia. And so India has at times found itself at odds with Europe, the United States, China, Russia, and others in advocating for the reform of these institutions to accurately reflect the distribution of power today. There is a second very different type of challenge, which is an actual challenge to the principles that underwrite this order. And I would say that these are largely threefold. One is coming in the form of China's rise. China is an opaque, a mercantilist, a revisionist power, and is increasingly acting in that manner. And it's in many ways coming, whether it's in freedom of navigation issues in the South China Sea, whether it's on trade, whether it's on cybersecurity, China is in many ways infringing upon very accepted international norms. A second challenge is coming in the form of violent Islamist terrorism. And this is also coming from the outside. We've seen there isn't a major country today, whether it's in Africa or Latin America or Asia or Europe or North America, that has not been affected directly or indirectly by this. And third, we're also seeing challenges from within some of the leaders of the international order, and this includes the United States and Europe. And this is driven by a number of factors, including growing inequality within countries, growing issues of identity. We saw this with Brexit. We've seen this in US politics. We've seen this in other countries as well. And the changing information environment. A changing information environment is also contributing to this. So these are the challenges that we now face. And I think from India's point of view, we have to make a very clear distinction between these two types of challenges. It's why it is completely rational for India to cooperate with China on AIIB, while not cooperating with China and in fact boycotting the Belt and Road Initiative. This leads me to the final issue, which is the international system actually collapsing, as is the premise for this panel? And the short answer would be no. It's not, but its terms are being renegotiated. When it comes to alliance issues, the US, and sometimes perhaps Trump is not the best communicator of this, but is really advocating for burden sharing. And this is something that many European leaders in private will say is completely legitimate. Europe has benefited from a US security umbrella and has benefited in material terms. It is now being asked to increase its share of the burden. So the plan B for Europe or Japan or Australia is starting to look a lot like the plan A for India. When it comes to trade, again, the biggest target of these tariffs has been China, and I think other panelists will go into more detail on this. The goods on which tariffs have been slapped on India is less than 1% in value on that's already been slapped on China, and there'll be more expected to come. And this is, in fact, a manifestation of a view that China has not been playing by the same rules as everyone else. So are we going to see a breakdown of the global trade order? Probably not. Are we going to see a breakdown in US alliances? Again, probably not. But we are going to see a very strong renegotiation of these terms. I'll end on that note, but happy to answer some of questions in the Q&A. Thank you.